Module 5, Immigration. Now here we'll be focusing much more on the historical aspects of immigration policy, because we'll be focusing on more modern, more present-day activities in class. But this will give you an idea of some of the historical perspective regarding the history of immigration policies in the United States. Back in the early 1900s, uh, there were a number of laws, again, targeting U.S. immigrants, but the focus were the population being targeted were those of Chinese and Japanese descent, and also those from uh, Eastern and Southern Europe, um, and also focusing on identifying individuals who are seen to be proper or could be proper Americans. So-called undesirables, homosexuals, mentally ill, anarchists. At the time, anarchist refers to anyone who's for unions or who had any type of anti-capitalist perspective. So there's been an attempt to trying to control who can move, who could become a citizen in the United States, and also to a certain extent, who can actually work, who can own land, and who can achieve full citizenship. Again, much of the attitudes here very much what's same kind of attitudes, same kinds of issues that are being discussed today for with other population, for those coming from Central and South America, those coming from other countries here. Similar kinds of arguments, but coming from a different part of the country. Just focusing on the experience of those immigrating from Italy as an example. Italians at the time were looked down upon and were seen as being undesirable. And you can see kind of examples in the current Immigration Act of 1924. The idea here is, again, identifying a quota for those immigrating from specific countries. And so for those coming from Italy, the quota went from 42,000 a year to just under 4,000 a year. Comparatively, the quota for those coming from Germany, Great Britain, and Sweden: Germany 51,000, Great Britain 34,000, Sweden just under 10,000. Now, Sweden being a much smaller country than Italy, could had more people being able to immigrate. And they also need to obtain a visa from the U.S. consul that are currently from the country of origin, which increases bureaucracy and create additional barriers for people, especially for those coming from from poorer areas of Europe. Now, some of the attitudes people have concerning the Italian immigrants, again, mirroring what is being said for many of the Latin American immigrants currently, that they're taking U.S. jobs, their beliefs about the inferiority of Italians, the issues of criminality of Italians. They're all attached to the mafia. There's also, anti-Catholic attitudes and issues around politics. So this is a situation again in the early 1900s in those regards to Italian Americans and those immigrating from Italy. And again, if we look at this, we can compare it to some of the attitudes people have for immigrants now. It can be very similar. And to the extent that there's evidence for any of this, again, non-existent. These were just the biased thinking of the population being used to manifest policy. And some of these activities lead to really gross injustices for much of the population, as the subsequent video will showcase.
After the bombings, two Italian anarchists, Niccolo Sacco and Bartolomeo Vanzetti, were picked up by the police. Their arrest would set in motion one of the most infamous events in Italian-American history.
Sacco and Vanzetti were out on a dark night gathering anarchist literature from the homes of their friends. There was all sorts of fear among the anarchists that another raid was coming.
But Sacco and Vanzetti, their arrest would set in motion one of the most infamous events in Italian-American history.
Sacco and Vanzetti were out on a dark night gathering anarchist literature from the homes of their friends. There was all sorts of fear among the anarchists that another raid was coming.
But Sacco and Vanzetti were being detained for a robbery and murder of two men that had taken place weeks earlier. Based on a tip, police believed the crime was the work of a gang of Italians. Sacco and Vanzetti both emigrated at the turn of the century, but didn't meet until years later after they became involved with the growing labor movement.
Neither of them were anarchists when they arrived in the United States, and it was their experiences as workers and the way they saw other working people treated that turned them to this most radical of political philosophies.
Vanzetti came to America in 1908 with much of the dream of America being a place of prosperity and freedom, and of course he was appalled by what he saw. He began to live on the street, and he began to do just simply the worst, harshest kind of labor.
Vanzetti would later write, "I arrived in America. I underwent all the sufferings, the disillusions and privations. Here I saw all the brutalities of life, all the injustice, the corruption in which humanity struggles tragically." Now indicted for first-degree murder, Sacco and Vanzetti stood trial in the summer of 1921. From the start, it was clear that the case was really about anarchy and about being Italian.
Judge Webster Thayer, he was fanatically opposed to radicals, hated them with a passion. I mean, it's not just a question of a conservative judge. I mean, there's a visceral hatred on his part for these kind of people. And of course, the fact they're Italian just makes it all the worse.
A man who was eventually on the jury, who was quoted as saying they ought to take every one of those damn Italians and hang them by their sensitive parts. The other thing that really hurt Sacco and Vanzetti was during the trial, they were marched out of the jail every day, completely surrounded by police. They were marched through the streets, marched into the courtroom, and seated in a cage. So they looked to the jury like very dangerous men.
So you've got a combination of the innate hostility towards Italians, because these are the kind of people who commit these crimes, all right? And thereafter, it's this kind of a setup.
In April of 1927, after a series of lengthy appeals, Sacco and Vanzetti were sentenced to death. To millions of workers, the verdict was symbolic of a greater injustice played out every day in the factories and mills of a newly industrialized world. Rallies and protesters filled the streets.
When they were finally sentenced in 1927, then it became the largest cause célèbre really that the world had ever seen. And all of that summer of 1927, there were strikes, there were protests, there were rallies for Sacco and Vanzetti in every major capital around the world.
They became celebrities at a time where celebrity culture was really beginning to take off. They blasted their pictures all over the place. But if you were an Italian, they were symbolic of ethnic prejudice.
It's symbolized from the point of view of not just radicals, in some cases conservative people. They were outraged by the trial proceedings. This was just, a farce.
At their final sentencing, Vanzetti delivered an impromptu statement.
Vanzetti, who was always more cerebral, he steps into the chamber and he says, "I have not been guilty of murder. I've been guilty of some sins perhaps, but never murder."
He says, "I couldn't even begin to say how we have suffered for things we did not do. I feel I'm also being convicted for things I am guilty of. I've been convicted as a radical, and indeed I am a radical. I've been convicted as an Italian, and indeed I am an Italian. And then he says, but I am so convinced of being right that if I could be executed 2 times and be reborn 2 times, I would still live to do what I've done. There were tears in the audience. People were just stunned by what he'd said.
On August 23, 1927, Sacco first, then Vanzetti, were electrocuted. Their names and their likenesses are forever linked in history. Hundreds of thousands of people came out for the funeral procession as their bodies were paraded through the streets of Boston. To many, they were martyrs. But to millions of Italians, they saw in Sacco and Vanzetti a disturbing parable.
I think clearly they saw this as the way in which Italians were regarded by this country, by the Anglo-Saxon dominant class, the disdain with which Italians were regarded. So I think it just reinforced this sense of you're an alien. You don't really belong here. You don't fit in here.
I believe that almost every Italian American, from the day they were arrested until on into the 1960s at least, heard the story at the kitchen table, probably, of Sacco and Vanzetti. It was a lesson. It was a lesson that probably only had to be repeated once. This is what happens, or could happen to you, as an Italian American, if you step out of line.
Now, since then, after decades after the fact, Italian Americans, along with Irish Americans, German Americans, and others who were previously discriminated against, change. They all become subsumed under this idea of being white, and so lost that the veneer that was affecting their lives. Other populations arose, other immigrant populations arose, kind of to take the place within society as the target population. Those from Central and South America, Muslim immigrants, all started to attain the same kind of stigma that Italian Americans, Irish Americans experienced back in the early 1900s. Similar kind of arguments, there's a certain fear and hatred of immigrants, fear of them taking jobs, of causing violence or crime, or using up resources. You know, back in the early 1900s, Italian Americans were stigmatized and being thought of being part of the mafia. Now you see many Muslim immigrants, or those coming from Middle Eastern countries, being identified as terrorists, in much in the same way. And you still see a continued kind of stigmatization. And we see a good example in terms of this current presidential election, where he had Donald Trump as a presidential candidate calling Latinos rapists, and where you have many others kind of following suit. And so the idea being that the kinds of experiences people had in the past kind of continues, but the people involved, the characteristics involved, changes. Now, in terms of the evidence, there is no evidence that those who were that immigrants are more likely to cause serious crimes than those who are native born. If you're looking at the statistics, immigrants are less likely to commit serious crimes, and that increased immigration is associated with lower rates of crime. But this is the evidence. However, again, individuals are not concerned with evidence, but trying to create a certain attitude, a certain belief concerning immigrants. And a lot of it also comes into play in terms of the terminology used. Now, there have been 2 ways that immigrants have been referred to in the United States, either as an undocumented immigrant or as an illegal immigrant. Now, the culturally competent phrase to use is undocumented immigrant. That is, again, they immigrated to the country, but they don't have the documents allowing them to do so. This is a distinction to make compared to the phrase illegal immigrant, which, or just referring to them as illegals, which is far more stigmatizing. That idea that they themselves are some sort of a crime. And so this again goes into the different groups trying to present a certain image and for a certain um, policy goal by stigmatizing certain groups of individuals. Now, in regards to health, many immigrant populations experience uh, social determinants of health that puts them at great risk for poor health outcomes. Issues around low income, low education, poor working conditions, living in overcrowded situations, lacking access to services, including and specifically lacking access to culturally competent services, especially services that are being provided in a way in their own language, has been problematic. All these factors come into play in terms of uh, people's health, health behavior, and subsequently many health outcomes. And this becomes a focus uh, for dealing with health policy. Now, a significant aspect that we'll be discussing is the fact that the Affordable Care Act explicitly uh, denies access by undocumented individuals. That unless individuals are native born or are documented immigrants, they will not have access to the resources for health care, which places this population at a greater risk for poor health outcomes.